So welcome to our Talking Tech webinar. And today we've got Dan McNeil, who is Engineering Manager and Director of Engineering at ComplyAdvantage. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. And we've also got Chris Hart, who's one of my colleagues at Client Server, one of the other team leads, and one of our other mental health advocates, or ambassadors rather. Hi, Chris.
How you doing?
Very good indeed. So we're going to have a chat today about management and mental health in the workplace, mental health within the male community, and no doubt the conversation will take a number of different directions. But Dan, just give us a bit of a background on yourself and tell us a bit about you and your position and what you're doing, and then we can go on and talk a bit more about perhaps talking about your management style and how you approach management of both sort of diverse teams, whilst also being aware of the way that management in the workplace has changed, particularly recently with people working remote and so on.
Yeah, so I've been a manager now for much longer than I was a developer. I started off as a developer and kind of moved over a period of a few years into management positions. And then, my career's grown from there. So right now I manage managers rather than manage developers directly. So I manage the teams responsible for our API and platform layers of the system. So basically everything except our data layer. I manage remote teams in Romania as well as teams in London. But as you say, right now, it doesn't really make any difference because everybody's remote anyway.
Yeah.
So, it's all the teams we're managing are remote teams now, pretty much. We did open our office up on a voluntary basis for people that wanted to come in, but to be honest, people didn't. We have an office for over 100 people. And yeah, we had maximum 12 people in at any point. So it feels like people have kind of shifted to this remote working.
And how has that impacted you as a business, either positively or negatively, do you think?
It hasn't impacted our business as such. I think what happened, and this is probably in common with lots of B2B companies, the first month or two of lockdown, I think nobody wanted to make decisions. So everybody was not signing checks. They were kind of waiting to see what happened. But then once everybody said, look, we're in this for a while, then the big corporates started making the decisions again, and our customers started signing checks again, and everybody started hiring again, because it was obvious that we can't just sit on our hands forever. We've got to start doing stuff. I think there was just uncertainty. If this virus had all come and gone within a couple of months, we would have had a couple of months of nothing and then back to normal. But given it hasn't, we've all adapted. But yeah, management I've always managed remote people. For many years, I've managed remote people, but it feels different, and it feels different not just because everybody's remote, but previously when I'd managed remote people, I'd managed people who had made the conscious decision to work remotely. So it was something that works for them, that they like doing, or their family or life situation means that they have to work remotely. And so they were set up for it. Whereas what we had now is lots of people who had signed up to work in an office with a co-located team, and suddenly, literally overnight, they're being told you don't have a choice, you're now a remote worker. And actually, the actual technical part of the work carried on. People were still writing and submitting code, we were fixing bugs, implementing features, pushing things out to production. That was all happening. But what needed a lot of work to keep going was to keep the team in contact with each other and keep that feeling of people being around people. And we put a lot of effort in at the start of lockdown to have things like virtual coffee breaks, virtual tea breaks, virtual cake breaks, just to get a few people together to talk about stuff that wasn't work. But I think in common with everybody else, I kind of drifted off those. We hear this idea of Zoom fatigue, and I think it really has hit that in the first month of lockdown, we'd have like 10, 12 people on every virtual coffee break. And now we don't get anyone. You know, everybody's kind of just gone, well, this is my life now. These four walls are what I see every day. And, you know, speaking openly for myself, it impacted me a lot as well. You know, I was used to being around people in the office every day, and suddenly not having that, even though, you know, I'm at home here with a partner, so I'm not completely on my own, but still there's a difference between seeing one person all day every day and seeing 100 people you might bump into and have a chat with and get to know and have lunch with and build those relationships in person. And I'm, you know, talking to mental health, I think it's worth saying fairly early on that I've had mental health struggles myself and still do. And one of the things I find the most difficult is organized social interaction with people. So I never do the work pub trips, I never do the Christmas parties, I never do those kind of things. So basically the only interaction I got with the team was the social stuff in the normal run of the office, you know, bumping into people in the kitchen, in the corridor, around desks, that kind of stuff. So when that was gone, I felt incredibly lonely during the working day.
Yeah.
Because me and my other half here have separate home offices. And so I don't see anyone. You know, I come in here at like 8 o'clock in the morning and I don't actually physically see another person till 6:30 in the evening. And that's been really tough doing that for how many months has it been now? 8 months? It's 8 months almost the day since we all went home.
Were you
Have
working?
you not gone back?
Was that, sorry?
Have you not gone back in between, like when the lockdown came off and went back up again? Did you go back in at all?
I've been in for 2 days. I went in for a day in August when the office was open on a voluntary basis, and there basically wasn't anybody there, and like 6 people in the office, and it felt like the closest I could get to describing what it feels like is, I don't know if you've ever done a job where you go and visit a customer or a client site in another country, so you're sitting at a desk but you're still kind of alone because you don't really know the people around you. Outside is a kind of slightly scary, anxious place, and you know that could be because you're in a place you don't know, if you're in a foreign country, you don't speak language or whatever, but in this case outside felt weird. Half the shops were shut, everybody's wearing masks in the coffee shops and whatever, and so it just felt a bit awkward. I just kind of thought, this isn't really, you know, I've come back to the office but it's not the office as was.
No.
And I went back in a week ago because we've actually taken the decision as a business, we're actually scaling down our London office for the duration of the pandemic. So we're still going to have an office for people who need to or want to go in, but we're not going to have an office of 150 desks, because if you've only got 12, 15 people at a time, firstly, it's expensive, and secondly, it just feels weird to have 12 people knocking around in an office that's built for 100. The other thing I did, when we had the rules that you were allowed to get together in groups of 6, we did have 5 of the team round to my place to work socially distanced for a day.
How did that work?
That worked pretty well, actually. It was kind of weird because one of the team members we'd never actually met before. We had a new developer start at the end of September and she'd never met any of the team. Actually, that's not quite true. The team leader had been for coffee with her on her first day in a coffee shop sitting outside, which was all you're allowed to do at the time. But it really did re-energize the team. You know, just being able to be in stand-up from the same place, you know, all sitting 2 meters apart. So it's a bit weird, but they're still in the same place. They can see each other. We had a lot more discussions, a lot more things got found out. And so I certainly don't think my teams will ever transition to fully remote teams. You know, they still need that occasional touchstone of going back in, being together, spending time together. And frankly, I need that as well. I really want to get back to the point where I can go into the office for 1 day a week, but not be on my own, because if I go in and there's only me there, 2 or 3 people there, there really isn't any point making the journey to London because it's not much better than here.
No, I think we found similar, and there have been certainly members in my team that have felt that they've wanted to go back in as soon as they possibly could, and I've got a varied mix of people that are still going in, even in between times, a day, 2, maybe even 3 days a week, just because they miss that social interaction. And there's a very different scenario between having, as you say, the interaction between a spouse or a partner, and having the interaction between sort of team members, whether it just be over a coffee, whether it be talking about the football results, whether it be talking about any given topic. It doesn't have to be work related. And I think that one of the biggest challenges from me, from a management perspective, was working out what worked for everyone and what everybody needed and what everybody lacked, because as a business, we've never really had a remote setup until the pandemic started, and then we obviously had to act very quickly. So I've never experienced having to manage remote teams before, and it was a pretty steep learning curve, and I can relate to what you said about the fact that you start off by, we used to have a stand up every morning, and then that might have lasted for the first week or so, and then it was kind of like you're almost chatting for the sake of chatting about work related stuff. So then and I know I've spoken to Chris about this as well in some of our management meetings. You start using those conversations to not necessarily talk about work, just to have conversations so that you feel like you're interacting, albeit through a screen. And now we kind of have I have an individual catch up with all my team on a Monday. We have a team catch up on a Wednesday, and we have a sort of wrap up at the end of the week on a Friday afternoon. But in between times, if I'm calling people, I'll often call them through a video platform, so that you actually feel like you're having a bit of FaceTime with people, rather than just being down the end of a phone.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things, for instance, phone interviews. We do all our phone interviews with candidates by video now, which we never did before. So actually, they feel better in a way. You feel like you're having a better conversation via video. But I think, as well as the professional stuff, lockdown has impacted, I think it's impacted everybody's mental health. I think that's fair to say. Everybody's felt something different during these past 9 months or whatever. And so I think I feel it's harder to create a safe space for people to talk about that on something like this, where you've got multiple people on a Zoom call, than if you've got people in a room. I think one-on-one, it's kind of okay. But as soon as you start having multiple people on a Zoom call, it starts, to me anyway, to feel less safe.
Yeah.
And we did have some people who have really struggled. I put myself in that bucket as well. It's, I think if you're already, if you have a certain capacity to cope with mental health issues, which we all do, if that bucket's already kind of partially full of the normal stuff that, if you have more struggles than average or whatever, when you add lockdown on top, it's easier for those of us that normally have some issues to deal with. The bucket's closer to full already.
Yeah.
And that's not in any way to say, I'm different, I'm special, I'm not. But I think for those people who were already struggling, lockdown has been really tough, even though the lockdown bit itself might not be any worse, but it's kind of piling on to other stuff.
Yeah.
And I certainly have felt that, and I know some of the team have felt that as well.
How have you found sort of breaching that subject with team members? Because I'm sure as a manager, you may have been and albeit I think how long have you been with ComplyAdvantage now? A year?
Just a year or so? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the team, I would imagine, fairly well, other than, as you said, that there are a few new members. But I mean, you probably understood enough about your team members to know whether they were struggling or not. I don't know how openly you talk within the business from a sort of management perspective around mental health issues, but how have you found that is, have you been able to sort of be as open speaking to people over video, and do you think they've struggled with opening up as much?
I think some people have. I mean, the thing to remember is I've been with Comply nearly a year, but actually I only spent 9 weeks in the office, and I've now spent 8 months out of the office. So I actually only had 9 weeks of FaceTime with people before lockdown anyway. I think for me, the key part to allowing people to open up, because I don't think you can ever make, or you wouldn't want to make people open up, because, you know, that feels a bit like prying, is for me to be open as well. Because if I do that, people tend to mirror the openness of the situation. So if I talk about how I'm struggling with some aspects of this, it kind of opens the door for other people to say, actually, that's impacting me as well.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not easy to do as a leader, because, you know, I spent many years when I first became a manager believing, and in fact being told by some organizations, that leaders weren't allowed to struggle with this kind of stuff. That part of being a leader was that you kind of had to be completely resistant to
everything.
You know, stress wasn't allowed to impact you, pressure wasn't allowed to impact you, you were never allowed to feel frightened or anxious, or, you know, I once was somewhere where basically I was told that emotion and feelings had no place in leadership at all. And I think we still, even if there's people like me who are now happy to, you know, it was put to me yesterday by somebody in the business that actually I do kind of wear my heart on my sleeve, which is true, I do. But that's still not always an easy thing to do. And actually an awful lot of people don't do it, because we still, if I go to an interview for a leadership position, I still get asked, how do you cope with stress? How do you cope with pressure? How do you cope with this? How do you cope with that? And I feel like if the answer was, well, frankly, sometimes I don't think I'd get the job in many places. Whereas I think that's the true answer for all of us.
Yeah.
Do you think that a lot of companies out there are still quite very old school?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think, and many companies that like to think they're not old school and like to think that, you know, we celebrated Mental Health Day by putting a banner on our website, so we must be fine. And that sounds really dismissive of me, but you know, for me, it's not just about that. I mean, that's important and that does help with your brand, but what you need to do is make sure that when you come into the business, there are people there who understand mental health issues. Just, you know, to me, it's just another form of diversity. It's just another form of the aspect of people that, you know, when you employ people in a business, you get people with all sorts of different attributes, and how people's brains are wired is just one of those attributes you get with people, and people's brains are wired differently. And some people find some stuff easy and some people find some stuff difficult. And
that's the term that I use. I use that term. It's the way that I'm wired. That's how I describe myself, and the way that I am is that it's just the way that I'm wired.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not right or wrong. It's just, you know, it can cause pain for yourself and sometimes for people around you. So you might, you know, it's easy to go, actually, if my mental health is causing me pain, I will label that wrong. But actually, you know, it's no more wrong than somebody who has a physical disability. It's not wrong or right. It's just a thing, you know.
And it doesn't make you more. It doesn't make you more or less capable of doing a job either.
No, and I think for me, that's the you know, that's the lesson I learned slowly. That actually, if you do suffer from anxiety quite badly, which I do, that it doesn't make you any less capable of being a leader. You know, it might make you a different kind of leader. But frankly, we need different kinds of leaders. You know, we need diversity in leadership as much as we need it anywhere else. And actually, I am quite resilient. I am quite tough in some ways, but not in others. And I think that's true of everyone. But I think because the the areas in which I think I'm less tough. So there are things, for instance, that other people find. Let's take a trivial example, but actually I'm fine singing in front of other people. And for most people, that would be kind of way up there on the, no, I'm not doing that thing. But I'm not fine walking into a coffee shop to meet a group of friends, or walking into a pub to meet a group of friends. You know, those latter things would be the kind of thing that would have me, you know, shaking and crying and sweating on the pavement outside.
And I bet that's quite hard to explain, right? You try and explain to someone that you're happy to sing in front of people, but you're not happy to go into a coffee shop. They won't get that unless they go for it themselves. No one will get that, which is, I find, a difficulty. Like, you try and explain social anxiety to someone, they're like, well, how come you can do that but you can't do that? It's like, well, that's just the way it is. It's just the way I'm wired, I'm afraid. That's how it is. Exactly.
It's a bit like, you know, it's a bit like phobias. We don't call it a phobia if you're, you know, if you were standing next to an angry tiger and were frightened of it, we wouldn't call that a phobia, because that's kind of like a normal thing to be frightened of. And in the same way, I think it's normal to sometimes be anxious. You know, the example I always use to try and explain it is, I mean, it's quite an unpleasant example, but the feeling you feel if a loved one is ill or in hospital or having an operation, and you kind of have this inability to think about anything else. You know, you don't want to eat, you don't want to think about anything else, you can't distract yourself by reading a book or watching TV, you're just kind of focused on this one thing. And that's what it feels like for me to do some things that to other people, it wouldn't even cross their mind it was something that might give somebody else a problem. And I think that because, you know, I'm relatively open about that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't shout about it, but I'm relatively open about it. I haven't always been, because I think society, and especially if you're in a leadership position, and I think, you know, to come back to something we talked about at the beginning, if you're a man, society tells you that there's something shameful in that. You know, there's a horrible phrases like be a man and man up and all these other things that it makes me kind of slightly queasy to even say out loud, that are kind of suggesting that there's something wrong with you if you struggle with these things. And I think that, you know, professionally, that's also true. And there've been a couple of, you know, the journey to accepting this for me has been punctuated by a couple of things that stand out for me. And one was a manager I had years ago, who I'm still friends with now, who was the first manager I ever said to, actually, I'm struggling with my mental health today, who said to me, well, you don't have to work then. And that was a turning point for me, because that was the first time anybody had said to me, look, as a manager, it's fine that your mental health might mean that sometimes you need to be off sick from work.
Was that during lockdown?
No, that was years ago. Okay,
so I was going to ask, is like, when did you become more comfortable with talking about it? Was that this year, or has it been a while now for you?
It's been in the last year or so.
Okay.
I think for me, there's been two things that have stopped me talking about it previously. One has been this idea of shame. You know, this idea that people aren't necessarily shaming you explicitly, but there is a feeling that if you have this, then there's something wrong and it's something to hide.
Yeah.
I read a book yesterday. It's a book by Will Young, the singer, and his book was about gay shame, which is a different thing, but a lot of it is kind of the same. The way society is set up to say, if you don't fit into this bucket, then that's something that you need to somehow hide or be ashamed of or explain to people. I think the other thing that has prevented me previously from being open is that the idea that you can't be a successful senior leader if you have mental health struggles. I'd heard that so often, I think I started to believe it myself. You know, I think I started to believe this is going to hold me back. And so there've been numerous times where I've shied away from taking on more responsible things or pushing myself in my career because of this fear that actually, well, all those people have told me that you can't do this unless you're absolutely bulletproof to stress and pressure. So I go, well, okay, I won't do that then, but, you know, because people have told me so often that I can't. And I think it's only recently that I've been in a place where, you know, certainly where I am now at Comply, it's absolutely not an issue. But you have to be very, very sure of that. You know, to doing something like this, where I talk about this openly, people at work are going to see this. And you have to be absolutely confident 100% that that's not going to impact how people see you at work before you do it. And, you know, I guess I'm very fortunate to work somewhere where I know that's the case. But many people aren't. You know, there are many examples I know of friends who are in successful careers, successful positions, leadership positions, and behind that facade, all this is going on for them, but they're not open about it. And, you know, there's no judgment from me. Everybody has their own journey, and people can be open or not open about whatever they want. That's completely their own decision. But actually not being open about it has actually caused them problems, because it's kind of, you know, if you're not open about it, the shame around mental health, the self-shame, can actually increase, because the more you hide something, the more it feels like it's something you have to hide, and the more concerned you get about, you know, I mean, I'll give you an example. We have calendars in the office. Everybody has calendars, and the way our calendars work is when you book a meeting in somebody else's diary, you can see the title of their other meetings unless they've marked it as private. And I had weekly therapy sessions, I still do, and I just put that as therapy and blocked it out for an hour in my diary. And somebody, a senior manager in the company, sent me a message to say, look, you might want to hide that. And that's a small thing. And I know it was coming from a place of,
but that says everything.
Yeah, it was coming from a place of wanting
everything.
Yeah, wanted to protect me. So I don't ascribe any malevolence on that, but actually just piles on the shame.
The
You know,
stigma, yeah.
Maybe I should have to hide that. Whereas frankly, does it matter if people in the company see that I've got a weekly therapy session? More than, you know, if I was having physical therapy on a leg that I'd recently broken, I wouldn't think anything about putting physical therapy in the diary for an hour every week. And that actually happened very recently. That's not an historic event. That's a, you know, that's a recent thing. But as I say, I think it comes from a place of wanting to protect. You know, it comes from a place of wanting to say, oh, I don't know if you wanted to be open about this. But even by asking somebody that question, you get them to question themselves and say, should I be?
I think more and more, I think most people can say that they've been either directly or indirectly affected by some sort of mental health. And, you know, whether it's themselves or a loved one or whatever, I think people are definitely moving towards being able to talk about it more freely and be more aware of it. But I think the transition of that within social circles to that within the workplace is a huge step. And I think the one of the biggest barriers, as you've said, is getting over the fact that it isn't a sign of weakness. I think you should almost praise somebody that is, you know, going through therapy or counseling or whatever, CBT. It doesn't matter what works for you, whatever it is. You know, that is you basically looking after yourself and training yourself. It's like, you know, it's like going to the gym. It's like rehabilitation. Rehabilitation of the brain or the mind is no different to rehabilitation of the body. And, you know, as you said yourself, you wouldn't give somebody a hard time for having physio, you know, but yeah, it's exactly the same thing. So I think the mind shift very much needs to be that kind of thing almost needs to be commended rather than hidden.
Part of the problem is that in my experience, there's a difference that people don't understand. Mental health is one thing, well, mental well-being is one thing, and mental illness is a different thing. But people who don't have any kind of things that they deal with on a daily basis, everyone automatically assumes that you're talking about mental illness. Everyone outside of the bubble, everyone outside of the circle, everyone outside of that community will automatically think you're talking about a mental illness if you mention the words mental health. So they always think the worst. That's part of the problem. That's where the part of the stigma comes from, that people aren't educated enough to understand there's a difference, that every single person has mental health, but not every single person has a mental illness. There's no wrong answer to either. Having a mental illness is absolutely fine. As Dan said, I look at it the same way. I'll give the same example. It's no difference to having chronic back pain or something. If you've got depression or anxiety, it should be treated and looked at in the same way, but people don't. As soon as you start throwing terms around like mental health, people automatically think you're talking about mental illness, which is not always the case. And that's part of the problem, I think.
Yeah.
And mental illness, obviously, in the same way as physical illness, comes in both acute forms and chronic forms. And, just because somebody has a bad back one day, it doesn't mean they have a bad back forever. So you don't need to keep treating them as if they've got a bad back forever. Somebody can have something in their life which causes them to have a short-term mental illness, or whatever we want to call it, that can be debilitating for them for a while. But you can't label them with that forever, because it could be an acute thing, it could be a chronic thing. And as you say, Chris, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's nothing wrong, it's nothing bad in either case. It's just a fact about that person. But you're right, as soon as the words mental health come up, everybody bristles a bit, as if, oh, this is a thing that I know I have to be really careful talking about this, but I'm not quite sure what to say. So I'm just going to kind of bristle a bit and go, oh, this is a bit, this is a topic like, if you're in a business meeting and somebody starts talking about politics, it kind of just makes everybody tense a bit and go, oh, no, I'm not comfortable with this conversation. And, it's the small things. One of the things we did at Comply not long after I joined was to explicitly change our sickness policy. So it just has a line that says, this sickness policy applies equally to mental health conditions as to physical health conditions. And it's only a single line. And to most people, they won't even notice it. But if that does impact you, if that is something that's important to you, that line is going to stand out like a beacon when you read the policy to go, actually, this is okay, because I know that if I do suffer depression, anxiety, or anything else, if I do need to somehow take time off, that's fine. The same rules apply. I can self-certify for so long, and I need a doctor's note after so long. And, that's exactly the same as if you had a headache or a cold or, a chronic physical condition that sometimes meant you had to take time off work.
I think the other thing that people don't realize, if they haven't been sort of directly affected by it, is the fact that there's very rarely a warning. It just as much as a physical disability or a physical injury, it can literally just appear out of nowhere, and when you least expect it. And it doesn't. There's obviously often a trigger, but you don't necessarily always understand what that is at that point in time. It could have come from any number of things, but the reality is, and from personal experience, it can affect somebody who on the outside is full of exuberance, confidence, and everything else, but underneath the surface there's a sensitivity.
And I think that actually, one of the things about doing this, when this goes up and people on LinkedIn see it, I admit apprehensive is the wrong word, because I think if you only knew me in a work context, you probably think all these things, because some of the things I find easier to do that other people might struggle with, it's like, I'm fine presenting to a couple of hundred people. I'm fine going to the senior leadership team and talking about progress, or even giving bad news to people, having difficult conversations. The really tough stuff like making people redundant, I've done that. I hate it, as it's the worst part of management, but it doesn't make me anxious in the same way that going swimming would. And as you say, Chris, that's really hard to explain to people, because they just see this person who can do all the things they would find difficult, so they presume your confidence must be up here Therefore, all the low level stuff here, they kind of see it as a stack rank. And, you know, where are you on confidence? And actually, it's a lot more complex than that. And, you know, to counter the good examples of the manager that, you know, said, yes, you can take a mental health day. In another company, I, you know, found that the strength, if you like, to confide in a senior colleague that I was feeling depressed. And his response was, what have you got to be depressed about? And, you know, that was the same company where we were told that actually managers shouldn't have emotions and feelings. So I guess I should have known, you know, that was going to be the response. But equally, I think what happened was the stuff, you know, the shame kicks in, and somebody like me, it's probably not the same for everybody, find yourself thinking, well, if there's something shameful about the way I'm feeling, I have to hide it, and I have to somehow change myself to be not that person. You know, if what I have to do to succeed as a leader is not feel these things, then let's pretend I don't feel these things and they might go away.
Was you quite high functioning?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I mostly am.
Yeah, I was the same. It wasn't until about, I can't remember now, about 2 years ago, I think it was, I started to get really bad chest pains. And that was basically just keeping everything bottled up for 30 years. Like, I've been the way that I am since I was a kid. Even my friends and my partner wouldn't have a clue. Like, I was that high functioning that I could hide everything. And about 2 years ago, I started getting really bad like chest pains on a daily basis. And we had 2 kids at the time, we've got 3 now. And if I hadn't had the kids, then I probably wouldn't have done anything about it. But I started to worry about that. I'm only 36 or 37, however it was 2-3 years ago. And I thought, I don't want to be dropping down with a heart attack at the age of 45 or something and leaving 2 kids behind. So that's what made me go to the doctors and initially get some help and get medication. Then I went to counselling and stuff. But other than that, I was incredible, still am. I was high functioning for 30 years and I would keep everything to myself. And especially at work, and I've been in those places similar to you where you're told that if you've got anxiety, you can't work in sales and things like that. I was a little bit in the opposite, that I would go out my way to try and take on more stuff to prove, even though I had no idea, but to almost kind of cover myself, I suppose, that I wasn't someone who had anxiety or depression or OCD or whatever it might be, that I could do more, I could take more and more on. I think that's probably where the chest pains ended up coming from, to be honest, to be fair.
It's a very interesting point, because I mean, obviously, mental health can have physical symptoms. I mean, as you say, it doesn't tend to so much with me, but it sometimes does. But I equally find, and this is going to sound silly, but it's true, whenever I get a cold and I get a bit of a fever, my mental health nosedives. And I know 100%. That sounds like a really silly thing to say, but it does.
No, I'm the same. It's almost like my depression kicks in a little bit for me when I get ill. It really, it's quite hard to explain to people what depression feels like. If you haven't had it, I would say the closest thing to depression is when a family member dies, like bereavement, or breaking up with someone. That's the closest thing that I can explain to someone what depression might feel like. And yeah, when I get ill or I get a cold or flu or whatever it might be, that kind of feeling starts to creep in. I can't explain why, and it's hard to explain that to someone. You say, like, you just got a bit of a snotty nose and a cough and this, that, and the other. It's like, well, actually, it's more than that for me. It means that when I get that, I also get this. And it's just really hard to explain to people.
And it happens a day before or so for me as well. It's kind of, I find my mood going really down. And then a couple of days later, I'll start sniffling and go, oh, that's what was happening there. And it's, but, comparing depression to bereavement, I agree. But I can honestly say that the bereavement after my father died was not as bad as a bad depression for me. Yeah, I mean, depression and anxiety for me are kind of, they're both there. I think I'd accepted the depression for many years. The anxiety, I feel, kind of, it's not newer in feeling it, but it's newer in talking about and exploring for me. And they kind of bounce off each other. I can get depressed because the anxiety can kick it off, and I can also get anxious about being depressed. And they kind of, but the feelings are almost opposite.
Oh yeah, 100%, yeah.
Depression is nothing, and you kind of feel like there's nothing here, and nothing I can do is going to stimulate me at all. Nothing anybody can do or say or I can do is going to change this. Whereas anxiety is just, it's like you've drunk 15 espressos. You know,
Yeah, I was saying it's like drinking a lot of caffeine. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually one thing that my therapist recommended to me that I've done is stop drinking caffeine, because the caffeine could sometimes cause the physical symptoms, which would then cause my brain to in some way go, oh, feeling a bit hyper, that's probably anxiety, and then off it would go, and it wouldn't be. So the caffeine was causing the physical symptoms that would then cause my body to go into that.
But you try and explain that to someone who doesn't have it, it's really hard to explain that kind of nothing feeling, and that kind of, isn't anxiety just nervousness? It's like, no, there's more to it than that. It's quite hard to explain to someone in a way. That's what I find frustrating. I'm not very good at getting across what I mean, and that's one of the things that annoys me more than the way that I feel. I think, like, I'm almost used to it. Like I said, it's been 30 odd years, so I'm almost used to it. It still annoys me, and I hate the way that I sometimes feel on a daily basis. But what I find that annoys me more is trying to explain to someone what that means and what it feels like, and then not go, yeah, but what have you got to be depressed about? Or it's like, it's not how it works. It's just not what it means.
Do you find, I mean, this is for me, I look for positives in it as well. So, you know, the one thing about being anxious about what other people think of me has led me to be the kind of leader where I always see things from the other people's point of view. So
very empathetic.
And actually, depression's great for songwriting. And, you know, feeling things that strong really does give you fuel to go and sit down at a piano and write some songs.
I've got my guitar sat right there.
Yeah, I mean, small positives, but you kind of have to take them where you can.
Yeah, for me, it almost makes you want to prove a point. Like, I might feel shit inside, but I want to prove a point on the outside, which is why I think sometimes I took more on than probably what I should have done. So it's almost like it kind of motivates me in a way. Like, I'm not saying I am quite proactive. I see things quite logically in a kind of black and white point of view, and I don't like quitting on things. And I think that's part of the fact that I don't want to let my anxiety or depression win. And sometimes it does, a lot of the time it does, but I'll still find a way at some point to go and do something that will make me feel better about it. So in a way, it kind of drives me on. I'd still rather not have it, don't get me wrong, but it also drives me on a little bit, I think.
And the other thing that I kind of struggle with the idea of therapy is there's part of me that thinks, if I didn't have this, what would I have? It's been part of my life for so many years that there's part of me thinks, if you could wave a magic wand and take it away, there'd just be this huge void. What would fill that void? And that sounds like a really weird thing to say. You know, like if you had a constant pain in your chest and somebody said, I'll take that pain away, it's a bit like saying, well, what would I do then?
Yeah. Part of me is like, I get that what you mean. Part of me is almost like I wouldn't want someone to cure it, because it would feel like I'm making it up, or like there was nothing to worry about in the first place. If someone could cure it like that, then they'll be like, well, it couldn't have been that bad then, could it? And it's like, that's part, I get what you mean. That's where my thought on that is what I just said, is that part of me would worry that if someone could just snap their fingers and cure it, everyone else would think, well, there was nothing much to worry about. What are you talking about?
Yeah, if there's something that I'm anxious about and I do somehow manage to overcome it and do it, quite often the people who I've confided in about that thing was making me anxious will say, oh, see, your anxiety is not as bad as you thought it was. Whereas I'd like, no, actually, it is as bad as I thought it was. I've just been really bloody brave coming here.
Yeah, and it was twice as hard for me to do that. Yeah. Yeah,
and you don't get that. You just go, oh, you see, it's fine. I'm like, it's not fine. And I think that, you know, we've got to the point where most people now don't respond to somebody saying they're depressed by just saying cheer up. But people do still respond to somebody who says they're anxious by saying you've got nothing to worry about. And for me, that's the same thing. It's like, if I could just go, oh, okay, then fine, I won't be anxious then. You know, don't you think I'd have done that if it was easy enough to just say, I'm going to turn this off?
Yeah, I completely agree.
You, Dan, you spend a lot of time outdoors. I know you do a lot of walking. You've done quite a bit of running through lockdown as well. How much value do you put on that in terms of the way that it sort of positively affects your mental well-being?
So the unfortunate thing for me is that exercise is one of the triggers of my anxiety. So it doesn't help me in the way that, I never get to the point of having the endorphins that help, because the exercise itself is the trigger. But getting outside certainly does. I spend a lot of time out in the garden. We're fortunate enough to be in the countryside here, so we have a decent outside space. So the garden's actually big enough to go and walk around or sit in or go to a different corner of the garden. The best thing for me outside tends to be keeping myself busy. Something I do a lot is we bought an old circus wagon, which is a whole conversation in itself, that we're renovating at the back of the garden. And at the moment, my endless job is stripping all the paint off the outside of it. And this thing is huge and it's going to take me months. So something I quite often do is just stick a podcast on, and for the length of the podcast, just go and get the heat gun and the paint stripper and just mindlessly strip the paint whilst listening to the podcast. I find it very hard to be outside and not doing anything else. I'm very bad. If I leave a gap in my brain, then the bad things will come and fill it. So if I'm out walking, if I'm with somebody, we'll be constantly talking. If I'm on my own, if I'm running or walking or whatever, I will always have a podcast or music or something on to just kind of fill that gap, because if I leave the space, my mind will go, oh, there's some free cycles there. Let's start thinking about anxious things, and off it will go. So for me, it's a case of keep myself busy. And, my family, colleagues, friends say, oh, you always keep yourself so busy. How do you do all that? And, my response is, well, do you know how shit I'd feel if I didn't? That's the honest. If I left the space, if I did switch off and just sit there and do nothing, it would all come flooding back. So actually doing all this stuff for me is about not allowing that space. And actually probably one of the things that drives me to be busy at work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely relate to that, because I struggle with my own company if I have too long to spend in my own thoughts, if you like. So and for me, I mean, I've got a pretty decent setup work-wise at home. My wife works in healthcare, so she's been working throughout the last 10 months. So I from that regard, I can concentrate, I can focus. But in the same way, you have to become better with managing your own expectations, in terms of the fact that I can't sit doing nothing. I've been fairly productive when I've been working from home, because I like to keep myself busy, because I have to. And then friends will often say to me, you're always doing something. So what I've actually struggled for of late, particularly as the days are drawing in, is my happy place, if you like, is outside. And whether that be in the garden, whether that be out with a camera, whatever it might be, at the moment, one day kind of merges into the next, because you get my body clock wakes me up at about 6 a.m. It's just about getting light. I work looking into the garden from my dining room, but then by the time I can actually go out and get some outside time, it's dark again. So I mean, silly things like, I say silly things, I'd say that lightly, sad or seasonal disorder, I definitely struggle a bit with that, and I almost have to force myself to get outside during the middle of the day to actually be able to get some fresh air, because otherwise one day can just literally merge into the next.
Yeah. I'm a sucker for a to-do list, like similar to Dan, that I get what Dan, where you're coming from, that you have to do these things to keep your mind busy. I do things because I get a kick out ticking things off the list. So it doesn't necessarily keep my mind busy, like it doesn't stop things creeping in. But if I write myself a to-do list and I tick things off throughout the day, that has a positive effect on me. Even if my mind will still go elsewhere, it will still kind of make me feel a bit better about myself that I've ticked things off. So I'm a sucker for a to-do list. So I get where you're coming from. You have to keep yourself busy. I'm very similar. It works differently for me, I think.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of bring this back to professional stuff before we wrap up, but that's kind of tricky in a leadership position, because in a management position, you don't do much. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, but I don't tend to produce things or do things. You know, it's a rare day when I come out of the day going, oh, there's a physical thing I achieved. I can tick that off my list. Most of the days, it's about slowly nudging a whole raft of things forwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I get that.
Is there anything else that anybody wanted to cover before we do wrap it up? Because it's, as we predicted, time has flown.
I could sit here and talk about this all afternoon.
No, I mean, go on, Dan.
I was going to say, from me, you know, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk openly. And I kind of, for me, I hope that me being open about this stuff, you know, gives other people a little bit of confidence to know it's okay to be open about this stuff. You know, I'm nobody special, I'm nobody important, but the more people that say, actually, this does impact me and I'm doing fine, I've got a decent career, I'm quite successful at what I do, I think will hopefully help other people realize that you can be successful even if you suffer with mental health issues.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect close. Thank you very much for your time, Dan. It's been much appreciated, and it's been fascinating just openly chatting about, you know, something that I think affects way more people than they even realize.
It's gone too quick.
It has. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you too. Appreciate
Likewise. Thank you very much. All the best.